Leiden from 1991, and he worked in the collection management, first in the National Museum of Ethnology in Leiden, and since 1997 the Royal Home of the Retired Military Personnel of Museum Brombeek. You will explain that, that combination. I'm not going to in detail because it's quite an interesting way how Brombeek was established back in 1800, long time ago. 63, thank you. Yeah. He became the director of this museum and the National Museum for Colonial History of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. His main personal interest in the transfer of military technology from west to east and vice versa within the colonial networks. In 2024, a new permanent exhibition opened, focused on the actions of the colonial government and the consequences of those actions for society. There's a real discussion going on in the Netherlands at the moment about colonialism, slavery and things like that. So there's really a big topic at, already for the last decade, I would say, in the Netherlands, yeah. And the king has offered his apologies to Indonesia and things like that. So really some hard work is done on that level as well. His team has been working on several projects on assembling data sets about European military in the Netherlands East Indies Army, civil service in the Netherlands East Indies and the Japanese internment. And we have quite a few people who have a relationship with the internment in Java who will be talking this afternoon also about that part of the history. In the past he has been working on iconography of the Second World War and the Netherlands East Indies and Burma Thai Railway. So please welcome PaulJac Verhoeven.
Paul and Nonya for inviting me. We were very much honored to be here to give this talk about a very sensitive topic, as you mentioned already. What I will talk today about is about several things that we do as a museum. You also already introduced that we have a lot of data sets available. These data sets are also available for you, so if you want to connect to us, we are open. We are a public institution and you can always contact us to get more information. It's all free, you don't have to pay for it, it's free. So let me start. We talked yesterday about grasping the audience. Grasping the audience as an institution is always difficult. It's a challenge. But in the way what you can do is, if you want to challenge to grasp people, it is the best to do something abrasive, to catch somebody's personal lives in the memories or the experiences of personal life. That is what grasps attention of the public. So you can do that mainly through personal histories. In our case, what we want to do as an institution, it has to mean something, and the most important part of what we do has to do with the Second World War. We talked about it yesterday too. The nucleus of what the Second World War was about is that something's never again. So never again these atrocities, never again prosecution of people, killing people. From the Second World War, the human rights movement started also. And from this human rights movement, we also talk about citizenship, because we want to live in a democracy. These kind of issues are, for us, I think, the nucleus of the museum. So I am from the Royal Home for Retired Military Personnel, Museum Brombeek. This is a drawing of the front. We are part of the Ministry of Defense. So the first thing I have to tell you is that there is a disclaimer. We are as a museum, we are independent from the Dutch government and the Ministry of Defense, and we do not necessarily represent the views of the Dutch government and or the Ministry of Defense. You laugh about these kind of things. You laugh about it, but it's a serious thing. I think in the Netherlands it's very important to be able to, as a museum, to be independent on the contents. Of course, there's always the matter of self-censorship in a way. But in the Netherlands, it works quite well. So Brombeek, as Paul already mentioned, I will do a short introduction on Brombeek. I can talk for hours about Brombeek itself, but that's not the goal of this conference. So it was founded in 1862 and opened in 1863. It was part of the Ministry of Colonies, and it housed the colonial soldiers. And this had mainly to do with the fact that the colonial army consisted of not of conscripts but of mercenaries, actually, people hired from the European market and also from the Dutch market. It was quite profitable to be a soldier, but it was also dangerous. You could get ill, you could get killed. So the government wanted to have enough soldiers coming in, and they provided this kind of service for invalid soldiers. From the beginning also, the government or the Ministry of Colonies used it as a museum for the history of the colonial expansion of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, and they showed it was open for the public from the beginning. Until 1959, it was part of the Ministry of Colonies because, as you know, from 1950 the Ministry of Colonies ceased to exist, and ceased to exist, and it was transferred. The text is a little bit low here. I don't know how the presentation is. So it was transferred to the Ministry of Defense. I will talk a little bit about the museum itself as it is now. We opened the new permanent exhibition in 2024, and it gives me the chance to talk to you, give you a kind of crash course on the Dutch colonial history, because I think that some of you don't know so much about it, so it's a good way of starting this lecture. So this is the entrance to the exhibition. The exhibition nowadays talks about how the Dutch government from 1816 took over the Netherlands East Indies as part of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. This was a colonial action, so the Dutch government opened this colonial area, and but from the beginning in 1816 we know about Indonesia, but Indonesia nowadays is much larger than the area that the government took over. So this government started to expand the whole colonial area and this expansion took about 100 years. So from 1816 to approximately until 1914, what we now know as Indonesia was actually conquered.
They took over from the VOC, wasn't it?
Yeah, they took over from the VOC, yes. Yeah, that was a little bit earlier. So there's an exchange of this territory from 1795 until 1816. The Dutch government, before 1814, the Dutch were a republic, and after the Napoleonic Wars, the British actually reinstated the Dutch kingdom at that time. So they moved one of the oranges, still the kingdom. The king is now related to the first king, of course, King William I. Took over the Kingdom of the Netherlands, and the British decided to return some of the colonies to the Dutch state. So not all of them. I talked to several of you yesterday. Some parts like South Africa and Ceylon, or Sri Lanka, what we call Sri Lanka now, they were kept by the British, but the Indonesian archipelago was returned to the Dutch. Had all kinds of geopolitical reasons to do that. They thought that in the early 19th century, the Dutch were kind of in between Germany and France and the British, so they could play this geopolitical game. And the Dutch government or the Dutch had to be able to pay for it, and they thought the colonies were enough financially as a background to establish this goal. So, of course, they needed a lot of soldiers to do that. It was quite an aggressive, really violent time to control all these islands. So we show that here, how this went. The third room we have is about, if you start doing that, you also introduce European people into the Southeast Asia area. That's what we talk about here too. So there exists a colonial society. So this room talks about, or shows this society. This is a colonial society with a European elite. This elite is on the top, but there's also a legal division of the society. In our case, in the Netherlands East Indies, there are three groups. There is the Europeans, there is the non-Europeans, or the vreemde Oosterlingen, or the foreigners, foreign Easterling, I don't know the English term for it so much. So non-Indonesians. And there's the third group is the Indonesians, or we call in Dutch inlanders, so the indigenous people. This is a legal division. So it means that in some cases, you can become, as an indigenous, you can move up to the other legal group. So you, as an indigenous, as an Indonesian, you could become a European by law. It doesn't mean that you can be the top, you can't be the Governor General, or you can't be in higher level job, but you are legally a European. And of course there's also racial differences in color, but it's not a racist society legally. So this kind of issues we show here is also what in exhibition we also deal with. Okay, what happens if you, as a European woman, you marry an Indonesian man, or vice versa? So what happens to you? Can you, and what happens to your children? In our case, it's also quite interesting. Some of the Dutch Indies people living in this situation, and also when we talk later about Camp Columbia, you can also see that if you are born from a mixed couple, if the man, the military man, for instance, the man gets a child from an Indonesian woman, if you recognize this child, you are a European. If you don't recognize it, you are indigenous. And it makes a lot of difference in your further life. Okay. So we have some interactive computers there, so you can sit down and listen to all kinds of stories about, more deep stories about the issues, and you can also have interactive choices how to deal with these kind of issues, as I mentioned before. When you move from this society, you also go to the next room, which is, I think, the nucleus of this exhibition. And this is about self-determination. Now we reach the time of the Second World War, end of the Second World War. And this, we'll talk about it later, is the United Nations, human rights, and self-determination for people. In this case, it's of course about Indonesian people choosing to self-determine to be independent. So what we call in Indonesian the proclamasi. So you see on the backside proclamasi an image of Sukarno reclaiming on the 17th of August 1945 the proclamasi, to the liberation of Indonesia. We, the people, decide we are free. This is the end of a long period, a long history of nationalism, of feeling independent. And this has to do with with the colonial situation that the society, the European society, also produces knowledge and transfers this to the local people, to the indigenous. These indigenous people, the Indonesians themselves, start thinking about what it is, in what kind of situation are we living, and they see this European elite. They also sometimes travel to Europe, get education, and they see that this situation is changing. Why do we have a different situation, different society than the society in Europe, for instance? So they start thinking about it and reacting against the Dutch government, the Dutch colonial government. So this develops, and in the end, this thinking already starts in the 19th century. It takes quite a long time, until 1945 actually, maybe 42 even, until this is resolved. What does the Dutch government, the Dutch colonial government, do? More and more repressive. So they don't like this. They don't want to lose control. That's something we are going to talk about. And if you lose control, what does the government do? They start reacting to this unrest. And what we can see at the end of the 1930s, we can see that the Dutch government, the Dutch colonial government, is actually becoming more and more like a police state. It's not real officially according to the definitions of police state, but we can see this is controlling everything. It's very difficult for local people like Sukarno and Hatta, the main figures in the nationalistic movement. Yeah, they get picked up and thrown into jail or banned to the islands like New Guinea. Yeah, the situation changes completely in 1942. Of course, 8th of March 1942, the Dutch colonial government capitulates. After that, that's actually the end of the colonial government. It never really comes back, manages to come back. Of course, it doesn't end in 1942, because in 1945, the capitulation of Japan, we start actually in the Civil War. That's what we show here. It is now called the decolonization war. Yesterday we talked a little bit about framing, so how do we call these periods? The Dutch government at the time called it police action. They called it police action because they said this is an internal affair, it's not a war against another nation. But nowadays, of course, we look upon this from a different point, more emotional maybe, and not from a legal point of view. So this room is of course the most sensitive room nowadays in the exhibition, because this is a history that people still remember. People are touched by this. Most of the families here, you have been living through this period. For the European society, the European people, European colonial elite, on a personal level, they lost everything. This was bad. You had 3.5 years of internment, or hunger, losing people. So emotionally, this is horrible. But for the government, from a government point of view, this is of course different. It's not about personal loss. It's about how do we deal with each other? How do we live? How do we organize our state? How do we organize a democracy? And we will go back to these ideas about the democracy at the time. So this is also for the Dutch government a difficult issue, and we have been dealing with this for the last 10, I think maybe, since 2008 actually. It's been a real issue, and we have slowly been decolonizing. This is a process that has not stopped since 1945. It's still continuing. So as a museum, we also collect material about this decolonization process and show it to the people here. Our goal, of course, is not to tell people how it is, but to give different perspectives on how we, as a nation, as a people, from different sides, but also from the Indonesian side, how we look upon this, because there are different perspectives. We also include in this exhibition the perspective of the Japanese. So the Japanese also have a perspective on what was happening, what was going on. The same you can talk about in your situation here in Camp Columbia. There's people living here, and there's people coming in, and this is a continuous process. And it's, I think, enormously interesting to follow, and also to think about it. How do we deal with it, and how can we express respect for the different perspectives? Of course, when you go through this exhibition, the last room is more like a lounge. Most people take in a lot of emotions, a lot of information. We also tend not to explain everything, and we talked yesterday about sending information, or if I talk to you like this, sometimes you fall asleep because that's too much information, or maybe I'm too boring. You send so much information, but sometimes you also have to pull back a little bit and let people think, and you don't have to explain everything. Museums tended to have, the trend was to put a huge amount of information on the walls, in computers and stuff, but it's also important to sit down and to talk about your own emotions, about your own experiences. That's this room. And on the back side you see, we talked about it yesterday too, is am I connected to Indonesia? So there's computers on the backside. You can sit down, you can stand down, you can put in the name of somebody of your family, and you can see if your family has a military past. In the future, we also will put in for civil servants, for anything that we can get our hands on. So for you also, if you have family in the camps, internment camps, or in the military, just send us an email, we can find the information for you. Because it starts like this, and it's what we talked about yesterday too. As your Camp Columbia Heritage Association, it starts with these personal stories, and you have to provide these personal data. And then after that, people start thinking, okay, what was it like to live in Camp Columbia? How was it organized? How did you get there? How did you get your food? What did you do in the evening? That is the second phase, actually. That's also what we do as a museum.
If I may?
Yeah.
There's this statistic going around that 1 in 8 Dutch people has a connection with Indonesia.
Yeah, it's a bit of a gimmick, I think.
Yeah.
It's nowadays the Dutch Indie Society mentions that there's about 2 million people that have somewhere a connection into the Netherlands East Indies. As a museum, we always is going back to basics. Is also what we do here. There's a lot of stories going on, and some of these stories they are made up, or they are is a perspective that may be not true. What is true? But for us as an institution, it's very important that most people think the museum, me too, you think what he's from an institution, he tells the truth. For us, that's hugely important. So we do a lot of research. Okay, what is the statement? Is it true? How can we find out the truth? And the truth is always a tricky thing. But in this case, it depends on your definition of what is the connection to Indonesia. So the Centraal, the CBR, Centraal Bureau voor Registratie in the Netherlands, they mentioned several years ago, I did this check, and they mentioned there's about 850,000 people in the Netherlands who have a direct link to Indonesia. And this is going down, because these people get old and they die. And so the first generation who were actually living in Indonesia until 1950, or let's say 1962, they are getting old now. Most of them are in the 90s or 100. So it's getting less and less. But if you think about, there's many links. There's also people who like Indonesia nowadays, or who are related to the soldiers that were sent from the Netherlands to Indonesia. Then maybe you can get to 2 million people. Is that really important? We think now this is part of our national history, so I think everybody should know about this. So in the curriculum, we talked about it yesterday too, about the curriculum for the schools. It is important to talk about these issues. Not so much that you have to know about colonial history, but it is important because you have to talk about citizenship, and you have to talk about human rights nowadays. And the whole situation in the world nowadays, from geopolitical view, you see that it reminds me a lot about the history of 1930s and 1940s. It's very comparable, so we can learn from that. But if I talk to this to young people, they think it's boring, of course. So you have to find this way, and usually the personal connection that works quite well. So that was a crash course in the Dutch history, a little bit of the colonial history of the Netherlands East Indies. I'm not talking about the West Indies, so Suriname and the Antilles. We also deal with that, but it's a much smaller, not a smaller history, but less people are connected to this. So there's about, in 1940s, there were about 300 to 350,000 Europeans living in Indonesia. 70 million Indonesians. So in the West Indies, it's maybe a tenth of that. So it's much less people are connected in this way. It's an interesting story, but it's a different story from our point of view. So I also want to talk about Camp Columbia, and I would like to investigate the mindset of the people coming to Camp Columbia, especially the government in exile, the Netherlands East Indies government in exile. What did they think? What did they want to do? What they wanted to achieve? So I have to go back to 1901. Don't be scared, but I think it's still an interesting story. Wilhelmina, she was the Queen of the Netherlands since 1898. So this is quite early on. She gave a talk. She had to give this talk. It was not her personal ideas. This is the Dutch government talking, and she gave a talk, and she mentioned something like the ethical policy. This became quite important for the development of the ideas of the Dutch government. So she said, literally, as a Christian power, the Netherlands is obligated to better regulate the legal position of indigenous Christians in the Indonesian archipelago, to provide more solid support to the Christian mission, and to imbue all government policy with the understanding that the Netherlands has a moral calling to fulfill towards the people of these regions. So the moral calling to fulfill towards the people of these regions. In this regard, the declining prosperity of the indigenous population in Java draws my particular attention. I wish to initiate an investigation into the causes. The provisions for the protection of contracted coolies will be strictly enforced. Efforts will be made to decentralize governments. So this is what we call the ethical policy. It's not much, it's subdued, you can read through the lines, but this is the start in the Netherlands policy of talking about, okay, we have to lift up the indigenous population, we have to make, we take a lot of money from this economy, and we don't give enough back. That was basically the thing. Around this time, Huig van Mook, the Lieutenant Governor General, we will meet him later on in Camp Columbia, he was born in the Netherlands East Indies and comes to the stage. His parents had a theosophical and Masonic background. He became a Freemason at a young age and published articles for the Indies Masonic magazine, which expressed his ideas. It's quite interesting that we can find his ideas in very early on. I'm talking about like 1918, so a little bit after this ethical policy started. He expressed his ideas. It was his duty to fight against the perceived assumption that we were more or different people than they were. As a sincere brother, the Japanese needed to be supported in his development as a free person, for I am convinced of the inevitability of Asiatic liberation, convinced that this liberation can be achieved in harmony with old Europe and young America. So this is what he says, he writes down in 1926. So this is quite an interesting idea, so we have to live together and move upwards. The colony was no longer considered for profit, but the Netherlands had a moral obligation to prepare the Emerald Belt for political and economic independence, in fraternal solidarity with the former colonizer, of course, and while preserving all the cultural and social achievements it had brought to the East. So there's always a trick, there's always an extra part for the Dutch to think it's okay if they move up, but under our guidance in a way. He was also part of what we call the stew. In English it will be the dam. So an association for the promotion of social and political development in the Netherlands East Indies. Sounds good. To promote, manage and direct Indonesian emancipation as befits a good lock keeper. That's what the dam comes from. So it's very paternalistic. So in 1939, the Second World War begins, and in May 1940, the Netherlands would be occupied by Germany. The neutrality of the Netherlands East Indies was no longer tenable. The threat from Japan was intensified by the United States. They boycott of strategic materials, and the Netherlands East Indies became the logical focus for Japan. And the Netherlands East Indies opted for a delaying strategy to prepare for the coming war. I listened to some of you yesterday and he said, yeah, it was a big surprise when the war started and nobody was prepared. Actually, that is not really true. So all these nations, the Americans and the British and the Dutch, they knew already from early on, 1905 already, when the Japanese war against the Russians was happening and the Japanese won, they were very much concerned with Japan. They knew that Japan was the enemy of the future. So they started to prepare for the war already in the 1920s, early 1920s. They organized themselves, they thought of a lot of doctrines, military doctrines to defend themselves. But as you know, in 1929 there was a huge economic crisis going on and there was no money. So especially in the 1930s, only at the end of the 1930s there was enough money to start buying tanks, ammunition. It sounds a little bit familiar like today, yeah? So everybody has money and everybody starts buying stuff. But can we do that? Is there enough factories to do that? And is enough money going around? So this situation is in the end of 1930s for the Netherlands East Indies. That's a huge problem. They want to buy tanks, so they go to England and they buy a tank. But in 1939, war starts. What does England do? Of course, you close down the borders and you say, okay, sorry, no export of tanks. Because they need it themselves. This is for the Netherlands East Indies as a minor power, like Australia, we'll talk about it later. It's a big problem. And then The Netherlands, they decide in this situation, 1940, the Netherlands is already occupied. What did the government do? What did Queen Wilhelmina do? She moved to the British side and they moved to London. So they get dependent on, it's more difficult for the Netherlands East Indies government to have a guidance from the parliament or the government in the Netherlands, what always was usual. So in 1940s they become a little bit more independent. That's actually what Van Mook, he thinks, yeah, that's great, I want to be independent. There's a movement in the European side in Indonesia too, to become more independent. We are economically strong, it's comparable to Australia. Why are we in the British Empire? We can do our own things, and we have to look at our own development. So that is the situation. It starts to become more independent because there is no father figure anymore. There's no government, or this government is in London and has not the ways of controlling what's happening there. Of course, politically, for Van Mook, the Dutch government in London sees this. So what they do, they try to control him in the end. That's important for later on. So they also, Netherlands East Indies, they are alone. So what do? We can be neutral, but we know that Japan is coming. Japan already sends in negotiators to arrange oil and rubber and all kinds of materials, because the Americans, they blocked Japan access to their oil and stuff. And so Indonesia, Netherlands East Indies know that they cannot survive alone. So what you can do, you can side with the Japanese or you can side with the Allies. And what they do, of course, they chose the Allies. They are no longer neutral. What also happens is that America and Great Britain had already decided in December 1941 that the war in Europe would take priority. And of course this was unfavorable for the reconquest of the Netherlands East Indies, and the Dutch government was therefore not consulted on this decision. In 1941 they also decided upon the Atlantic Charter. This is Van Mook when he was still young, the stew. It's interesting that this stew, I have to go back a little bit, is that not only Van Mook was part of this, but also Logeman, and Logeman became the Ministry of Colonies during the war and after the war. So this whole group of people that very young at the time already had built up these ideas about the future of Indonesia, and they become on the top level civil servants in the 1940s with these more liberal ideas. And have to be careful, they are liberal, but they are conservative liberals in a way. So in 1941, the Atlantic Charter, most of you maybe have heard of it, is a kind of precept for the United Nations. And one of the points that America and Great Britain decide, and that's point 4 actually, is the right of peoples to choose the form of government under which they will live, and they wish to see sovereign rights and self-government restored to those who have been forcibly deprived of them. That's of course hugely difficult for the colonial governments. America actually says, and Britain too, we don't want colonial empires anymore. So in 1942, opinions also differed regarding decisions regarding the strategy to be followed. America questioned the desire of both Netherlands and Great Britain to restore their colonial empires. And the Netherlands considered Great Britain a more natural ally than the US, though this would change during the war. The US also increasingly promoted China as a future major power, which both the Netherlands and Great Britain considered undesirable. Sounds familiar, almost. So nothing new. In preparation for the coming war, the Netherlands East Indies government decided to appoint a Lieutenant Governor General, which became Huib van Mook, man you saw just now. He was tasked with assembling a team to represent the interests of the Netherlands East Indies government in exile. Ultimately, choices had to be made on military strategy. should they invest in combat power to drive out the Japanese troops, or in an organization capable of restoring authority? This last problem was classic for the situation in the Netherlands East Indies. The relationship between the army and the domestic government had always been tense. On the 15th of January 1942, the Abda Command was established. The American, we didn't talk about this yet, but the American, British, Dutch, Australian Command to defend Southeast Asia against the Japanese advance. The Netherlands East Indies helped defend Singapore, but 10 days after the fall of Singapore, on February 25, 1942, Abdacom was dissolved, and the Netherlands East Indies had to defend itself. This caused for the Dutch huge frustration, of course. They felt left alone. They had to fight for themselves. They had helped the British and lost almost all of their air force and part of the navy, and couldn't really defend themselves.
The same sentiment is for Australia, because Australia was no longer supported by the Brits, and that's why Australia went to America, and that was a major shift in Australian foreign policy. From before that time it was focused on Britain, after that time it became focused on America. Major shift in Australian policy.
Yes, of course, and this continues throughout the war. And it's, of course, it's very unfortunate that Jack Ford is no longer with it, because I was very much hoping to meet him, because he is one of he was for us the only one to write about this kind of things. And you see that the Allies in the Bind explains this quite well. Australia and the Netherlands East Indies, or the Netherlands, they should have worked together in a way, because they were both minor powers and had the chance to, if you work together, you are more strong against the United States and the British. But in the end also, there was also political choices to be made. So the Netherlands East Indies had a different way forward and then the Australians, or the thinking about it. So that's also what we see in Camp Columbia later on. Okay, how do we deal with this? Because the Dutch also had their own geopolitical analysis. And they wanted, of course, Netherlands East Indies to be freed as soon as possible, because they didn't know so much what was happening in the Netherlands East Indies. It's like a black box for most of the people. It's the same like the story about Camp Columbia. It's a black box nowadays for us. Nobody knows exactly what happened, because the history moved on. And it's not a backwater, but it's maybe not that much. People think it's not that interesting, because we know what came after. But before I go into it too much, let me go back to the story. So the Dutch government had to deal with the coming war by itself. So while Europe was in grip of World War II, it's also important to remember the situation in the Netherlands East Indies is getting more tense. It's more frustrated, not only for the Europeans, but also from the Indonesians, the nationalists, so Sukarno and Hatta themselves. You see that some of these the Indonesians, the organized Indonesians, they go to the Governor General, Tjaga van Starkenborg-Stachauer, and ask him actually to, okay, we know that war is coming, we want to help, we don't like this war, we also want to be part of the military in a way. But if we are part of the military, we also have to be able to vote in a way. Yeah, that's a normal thing. And then, so the Dutch government, the Dutch colonial government has a moment, okay, what do we do now? And this is actually going on from the 1900s, from the ethical policy already, that is, okay, how much room do we give the Indonesians themselves to govern themselves, to be a real democratic society? And then the Governor General and also the Dutch government in London, they decide, no, we're not going to do that. That is really a turning point for the nationalists. Okay, we don't have anything to get from this colonial government. It's finished. So when the war starts and the Dutch government loses, yeah, most of the Indonesians are great. Japan is coming in. They are liberating us in a way. And so this is also the mindset for the Indonesians in 1945. We have been struggling for, let's say, 100 years against this imposing European government, and we didn't get anything, or not enough. So while Europe was in the grip of World War II, the Volksraad, this is a People's Council, in February 1940, again urged a revision of the constitutional structure that I was talking about. there's always these difficult Indonesian names, Purbo Hadi Joyo motion expressed this most clearly, just as in the Sutarjo petition in the 1938, I think it was, a more independent position for the Indies within the kingdom was requested. And the establishment of a national council was also proposed. When the Netherlands East Indies government rejected this, as it did with two other motions of nationalist intent by Mohammed Husni, Tamrin and Sutarjo, the submitters decided to withdraw it. When the Netherlands East Indies government failed to respond to these motions, they decided to address the Queen Wilhelmina directly in a telegram on August 9th, again advocating the proposal for a full Indonesian parliament. However, on the advice of the colonial minister Welter, his telegram remained unanswered. So stick your hand in the sand, stick your head in the sand and don't answer it. So in 1942, Wilhelmina, this is again a geopolitical issue. In December, 6th of December 1942, Wilhelmina went on the radio. This was mainly aimed at the Americans, at American geopolitical because the American president already stated before, as I showed you, that colonial empires are no longer fashionable and we have to get rid of them. So she needed the support of the Americans, of course, during the Second World War. So she has to show something is happening in our thinking. So she goes on the radio, and this radio speech is later on from 1945 used as a kind of basis for the government in exile to prepare their policy. So what she said was, this is a part of it, recent years have demonstrated that both peoples possess the will and capacity for harmonious and voluntary coexistence. A national unity established on this foundation will lead to the realization of the goal for which the United Nations is fighting, as embodied, among other things, in the Atlantic Charter. So she reminds them of the Atlantic Charter, with which we could immediately agree because it contains the foundation of our own conception of justice and freedom, for which we have sacrificed our blood and soul throughout history. There will be no room for differences in treatment based on race or nationality. Only the personal ability of citizens and the needs of the various population groups will determine the government's policy in the Indies. 2. An oppressor currently reigns, following the example of his detestable allies and rejecting principles he himself has recognized in the past. In turns peaceful citizens and deprives women and children of their livelihood. So this is what she talks about, and you see she is really wanting to change the society, but within the constraints of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. Then the war starts. One year before she gave this talk, the war had started already. We talked about yesterday about the Malayan barrier. Is there a pointer here? Yeah. So this mainly focused about Singapore, and this is an interesting map I found because we talked yesterday about the fact that the Japanese plan was to take Java and then stop. But of course the people in Australia didn't know, the British didn't know that the Japanese wanted to stop here. And they were afraid that the invasion would continue. That's why, of course, they stopped Atacon and retreated in a way. So we did a lot of research about this. Well, I just wanted to show you a little bit of the research we did. These are also the attack lines of the Japanese. That's too quick. I'm sorry. We did research in Japan, and also it's interesting to get the information from Japanese side, their point of view, so military information. Just know that we have it. If you're interested, we translated some of it. You can see. The most important part is, of course, the loss of Bandung in the end caused the Dutch government to capitulate. First, yesterday David Horn also showed some of the paintings that the Japanese did. I saw some of them. These are paintings in the Museum of Modern Art in Tokyo these are propaganda paintings, but actually they show for the Japanese what they thought was a very successful attack. And one of these paintings is a painting about the landings, the parachute landings in Palembang in Sumatra. For the Japanese, this was quite a strong feat. The first time they used parachutes to attack. The attack itself, it worked, but it also didn't work in this case. They lost actually. The most important painting for us is this hugely, it's a bit of a mess, but this is actually the attack, this is a counter-attack of the Dutch near the airfield of Kalijati. We talked about air supremacy yesterday. The problem in why did Java lose is because they lost air supremacy. You can see, the Japanese also knew that, so you can see here, this is the Japanese airplanes attacking the column with the counterattack of the Dutch. And this painter also made sure that everything is in it. So there's dead soldiers here, but all the weapons that the Dutch used is in this painting represented. It's a complete melee of all kinds of stuff. But actually this is the moment that the Dutch lost. And also not only the military losing, but it's also the Dutch government, the colonial government is actually lost now. This is the end. Very dramatic. And also we did, as I said before, you mentioned already, we'll be doing a lot of iconography research, because to get the audience in, it's also important to show pictures of it, because you have to show it's real. Especially war is real. And pictures of the Second World War in Asia, it's quite rare. That's because the Japanese, they send in embedded journalists, photojournalists too. There's a huge amount of photos available about this war, but most of it is still in Japanese archives. It's quite difficult to get it. We managed to do this with a lot of effort, but in this case you can see, okay, this is a Dutch armored car. You see people killed here, and actually this for us is the important part. This again is the negotiations with the Japanese on the 7th of March 1942. Here they arrive to have talks with the Japanese. You can see the faces are really tight, of course, and the Japanese had threatened to bomb Bandung, where all the Europeans were gathered, and so they didn't have a choice. They had to capitulate. They were also, as I said before, frustrated. The Allies left them. Nobody came to fight. Not all, because some Australians also were still on Java. That's called the Black Force. They were very successful in a way, but too small to matter. And here, this is a very iconic picture. It's from the Japanese journalism. This is the Governor General, Starkenborg-Stachauer, and the commanding officer, Terporten, the Lieutenant General Terporten, and they go into captivity. This is actually an iconography, strong picture, end of the colonial government.
Yeah.
He was important, especially for the situation that started in 1942 after the capitulation. This is Admiral Helfrich. He's a Navy guy, and he became the opponent of Van Moog. I will talk about it. Somehow it's So I want to talk a little bit about the geopolitical analysis. The alliance's strength guaranteed Japan's defeat. They knew that Japan was going to be defeated. So the reconquest was certain, but the timing was uncertain. So in December 1941, the US and the British decided to prioritize Europe, I said it already. The Netherlands East Indies government was not consulted. And the UK wanted to retain Singapore, and the US saw no strategic necessity, even they thought even it was a waste to try to retain Singapore. And the UK and the Netherlands wanted to resume their pre-1942 positions. That was the goal, and to reconquer the Netherlands East Indies. And the Netherlands East Indies had a choice between the Americans, who had the resources, but they didn't want to they wanted to decolonize everything, or they can choose the British, who pursued like the Dutch a colonial status quo. Moreover, the Americans were also increasingly prioritizing China, as I said. There were also internal divisions within the Dutch government. There were actually three choices: which ally fighting against an established alliances or restoring authority, and civil versus military authority. The British during the war didn't make a good impression. There was a lack of rapid and effective action throughout the war in Southeast Asia. The Dutch chose to go with the British and established a central command in Ceylon, what's nowadays Sri Lanka. Helfrich, you saw him now, is no longer under the Netherlands East Indies government, but under the Dutch government in London and within the British theatre. The conflict between Van Mook and the Dutch government, especially Helfrich, will continue all during the war. Van Mook analyzes that the Americans are a better bet. He invests in the relationship with MacArthur and America. The central government concludes that the Americans are not interested in the Netherlands nor Australia, as they are minor powers. Van Mook agrees partly, but is hopeful that they can just follow the Americans. He is reluctant to deploy Dutch military force other than for the Netherlands East Indies. And anticipates political problems after the recapture, so he has quite a good idea of what's possibly going to happen. The army is necessary for this, because if the Indies were recaptured earlier than Europe, a potential disaster scenario would arise in Europe. Japan would disappear and the Allies would be uninterested in the Netherlands East Indies. The Netherlands should focus all its manpower on restoring authority. So not kicking out the Japanese, because that would not be necessary, but to restore the authority of the Dutch government. The problem wasn't Japan, but a vacuum of authority. The best equipped organization to deal with this was the KNIL, the Royal Netherlands East Indies Army, because they had been doing that for 130 years almost. So Van Mook, he expresses this in an interesting radio talk in September 1944 in London. The course of events in Europe and the Far East has made it necessary to establish a provisional Netherlands East Indies government, which will be based in Australia until it can be transferred to the liberated Netherlands East Indies territory. Furthermore, existing legislation will be maintained as much as possible, and efforts will be made to restore local government in the liberated territory as quickly as possible. The regulations for this period do, however, provide for the appointment of a temporary People's Council, see the People's Council coming back, consisting of one member, also chairman, and at least 15 to a maximum of 30 members, of whom at least 3/5 will belong to the Indonesian population. The temporary People's Council will have the same powers as the council possessed before the Japanese occupation. So although there is a democratization of this People's Council, he still maintains, of course, okay, it cannot be, it still has to follow the same rules as before 1942. So there's no progression in a way, it's going back to the old situation. The same goes from Logeman, we remember him, he's a Minister of Colonies, or Ministry of Overseeing Ministries, in 17th of July 1945. He says it's also willing and able to understand the spirit of the times and act accordingly. Well, that sounds good. The Netherlands is not going to retake a colony, it is setting out to liberate the millions of Indonesians it wishes to receive as partners in Queen Wilhelmina's kingdom. Again, the kingdom of the Netherlands has to be still this imperial power. And on the 15th of August, capitulation of Japan, the same man, he says, if we are to be entrusted with the responsibility for peace and order, the Indies government will need a governing body. Without that, our kingdom will not be allowed to be master in its own house. Without that, we will therefore not be able to give Indonesia the worthy place in our home that we have envisioned. So, not talking to the Indonesians, because he couldn't do that, but still this mindset is there. And this is August 1945. In October, he says, only because a group of fishermen in troubled waters temporarily prevents us from working for their own people and blindly teaches that people to vilify what we did for the Indies. He talks about the Japanese occupation, of course. We who developed and structured its society in such a way that, provided all its constituents are called up to upon to labor. The Indies can independently manage its internal affairs and can therefore be admitted to full participation in the kingdom. Again, so they know exactly what they want, and that is what they are thinking about in Camp Columbia. Here we see some of the images that we have in our collection. For you, this is interesting, the soldiers coming in. These are soldiers transported already in 1944 to Camp Columbia, coming from sometimes Suriname and the Antilles, or from London, or from all over the place from America. And they arrive by train. For the first time also, we talked about, you will talk this afternoon about the VK Knil, the women's corps from the Knil. You see here the first time women within the military structures of the Netherlands East Indies. They arrive by car, by truck, and they are more or less paraded through Brisbane. People can see them. And here, I don't know the situation, it was probably, looks like a countryside road to Waco. Arriving here, you can see these are definitely Indonesian or Surinamese. This is a group, this is in Waco itself, in Camp Columbia, the women corps arriving. Oh, this is not good. This is not, this is a remnant. Yeah, here the main actors coming in. This is Van Moog, Lieutenant Governor General, Charles Olke van der Plas, and some other military. These are the buildings, the government buildings, the office buildings. He's arriving at the square and he's talking to people. You can see there's quite a lot of people, I think you know better than me, 2,000 people working and living there. You can see that they are standing, the military standing. Yeah, this is the government in exile sitting at the table talking, and you can see here Queen Wilhelmina, of course. Sometimes relaxing and sitting outside. This is actually a picture when he moved in 1945, in October 45, he moved to Batavia or Jakarta, that's not Jakarta. Van der Plas working. Man with a beard. I think this afternoon we'll hear about Van der Plas too. A very interesting man also. Van der Plas was not part of the stew, but he was also a long time career in Indonesia. He also was the consul in Saudi Arabia for some time, for 6 years. So he had good connections with the Islamic population in Indonesia. Interesting man. He was, after the war, he was not really accepted by the Indonesians, and he didn't.
I think he was an Islam, a Muslim.
Yeah,
he was a Muslim.
Yeah.
That's an interesting group of some of these civil servants and even military that turned into Islam.
Yeah.
There are more examples of it.
Okay.
And we didn't talk about an important person. He's not been mentioned yet, but this is Simon Spoor. He at the camp, he was working for the Netherlands Forces Intelligence Service. We talked about yesterday. I was interested in the intelligence services too. It's always fascinating. They were working together with the Allied Information Bureau. They had quite an extensive group of people, spies and people coming in. And a lot of Indonesians captured, for instance, in New Guinea. They were taken to Camp Columbia, and they had to, how do you call this? They had to be debriefed what happened and what kind of experience they had with the Japanese. And he was the leader of this group to write down these reports. He became, of course, in 1945, when the Dutch government and the Netherlands East Indies government had to decide, okay, what are we going to do? He was appointed as the commander-in-chief for the Dutch forces. And he was quite young at the time. He was, when he came to Australia in 1942, he was still a captain. And at the end of the war, he was lieutenant general. So he made a huge career. And they passed over all the old staff. So all the older generals, they were demoted, or at least they didn't have any position anymore after the war. There was an obvious a choice on purpose to do that. So they changed the whole top level. And he was the man who became important also in the, we call the police actions. And he was a hardliner CNIL person. So what we now think, and we'll talk a little bit about the post-war problems of the research that has been done, he's the focal point, and he thought his doctrine was, okay, which was an old, what we now call the DNA of the CNIL doctrines, is a tough guy. So if we hit them hard, we will succeed. And he did. And here you see this, of course, it was a huge effort in intelligence. Of course, the Dutch were very knowledgeable about Indonesia itself. They knew what the people were like, what the situation was like. So the Americans had plans during the war, or MacArthur wanted to invade Indonesia, and of course the Dutch government in exile also wanted to have this invasion as soon as possible, because they wanted to go back there. They didn't know what was going on. They had suspicions, but in the end his intelligence operations did not succeed. So there was no information coming in from Indonesia to the Allies, actually. They have no idea what was going on politically. So they were, in 1945, August, they were surprised about the national movement was being so strong. And they wanted to suppress it. And they wanted to get the country back into the kingdom, back into the imperial construction. So these are pictures of the camp itself, and you see there's a lot of work going on. These are not only Dutch people, of course. I talked to Nonya this morning already. We also have a list of all the local people enlisted into as secretaries, as researchers into the camp. So a lot of Brisbane Australians also worked here. We don't know, of course, who all these people are. Yeah, this is we have going back to. Of course, you can talk about the official government, but you can also look at the personal experience of people. And this is an interesting diary almost from a woman. She's sitting down here. This is her. I talked about it. She made a big album with her whole experience in Australia, because she came to Camp Columbia in 1945, and she stayed until the end of 30th of April 1946. And she writes down all her experiences. So she made, I never seen a map, a Dutch map of the camp itself. So this is a map, it's about this big. I think this is something that was given to people coming in, because you got so many thousands of people coming in, and you need to explain it's a large area, where is what. So this is the camp, partly in Dutch and partly in English. I checked with Ed yesterday. This is the Waco station. I think Pooh Corner is somewhere here.
Yeah. Here's the sewerage that we will see. This is the top of the hill where the
These are the
offices
we saw.
Here are still remnants of offices, etc. But interesting, we didn't know that, Ed. Yeah. Here was the laundry and theater. It's all in Pooh Corner area. Yeah.
Very diagrammatic, of course.
Yes.
Yeah, it's not
very useful.
But we can use that on.
So she's sitting down here in her cabin. She made a drawing of how the cabin inside was. And this is number C17. If you go to the map on the back, you can find C17. It's about here, I think. This is her again, and you can see with the koala. This is her. This is her name. She's Gerada Johanna Stad. She was a sergeant major in the VK CNIL. And she was I think she was a nurse.
We're working on a recognition of the women in Brisbane, on the Dutch women in Brisbane, trying to get the plaque, because you've got all the men covered, but we don't have the women covered.
Where did they come from, these women?
I think I have to check. I didn't check. I think she came from the Netherlands.
Because there were a lot from the Netherlands, East Indies.
There's also, so it's a mix. It's not only Dutch women. There's also Netherlands, East Indies women, Surinamese also.
We've also have Dutch people from Canada who were recruited by Princess Irene. Yeah, Anna Beemstra.
I'm talking about her.
There you see the offices, of course, it's a mix. She has many more pictures. Some of these pictures you can also see here. They are official pictures made by the Netherlands East Indies Government Information Service, the NIGE. And they had an area for relaxation and drinking. So from already sitting there, you see here too. Very rural, right? It's rural. It's
Oh yes,
quite primitive.
you'll see tomorrow. Yeah.
That's why it's a nature reserve now, a lot of it.
Yeah. And of course, this is one of the groups that she was working with, and this is end of 1945, almost the end of the. We don't know all. Maybe we can reconstruct it. This is Mrs. Stam, Sergeant Major. She's standing here, but there's no name list here for the photographs. What I found quite interesting is this in Dutch the bekendmaking, so the announcement on the 11th of April 1946 about the ending of the camp. So the Dutch had to leave, and they also write down, okay, you have to find a new accommodation. You have to do that by yourself. The government didn't do that, so they had to go out to Brisbane or so and find a place to live. And they said also, be careful. You have to bring everything, and be careful because it's a bit of a chaos now and. A lot of stuff gets stolen now, so you have to be careful about your own stuff. So it was quite chaotic, I think, in the time. So 11th of April and the 30th of April, they had to evacuate the camp. So we know that 30th of April, the Dutch left.
Don't leave your sword behind.
And the planes.
And this is the farewell party. So there was still quite a lot of people working there in 1946. Yeah, then we come to, I talk a little bit about the post-war, I can talk, I don't know how long I have.
I'll just keep an eye on it, I'll let you know. Yeah. No, Jorien is not here.
She is. I talk a little bit about what happened after that in the Netherlands, about the current situation in the Netherlands, how the government and also researchers deal with this situation and the decolonization. So in the end, these are the photographs. These kind of photographs, they give a good image of what actually happened in 1945. You see, this is in Batavia, I think, and the right of self-determination. This is very early on. The Indonesians knew exactly what they were doing. They were not aiming at the Dutch. They were aiming at the international audience. The British, of course, took over the power in 1945. The Dutch didn't have enough manpower, or were not allowed to go in, and the Indonesians. They had a good PR movement. That's great. These are the most important people, of course, Hatta, Sukarno, and Sultan Shahrir. In the beginning, they are the most important figures. And they played the international audience quite well and succeeded in the end. So what happened after 1950s, it's interesting to see that the Dutch presented themselves, and this was a history that was painful, and they presented themselves more and more, especially in the diaspora movements, or the people from the European people from the Netherlands East Indies. They considered themselves to be victims, and it's a victimization. You can understand this because it is a traumatic history. You lose everything on a private level. On a level of government, it's a different story, of course. But you see that also the government doesn't recognize this suffering, doesn't want to talk about it. It's kind of amnesia, and this amnesia is not limited to the Dutch East Indies government or the Dutch East Indies people. It's broad in the Netherlands from the 1950s onwards. And then after, let's say, 1960s, end of 1960s, this starts to become an issue. And why is that? Yeah, because the Japanese emperor visits the Netherlands in 1968 or so. And this is the same emperor that was emperor in 5 minutes, who was emperor during the war. So there's an enormous upheaval in the Netherlands about, okay, we have to remember this, we have to start talking about it, and people do it. And then in 1969, there's a famous TV program. It's called the Hüting Affair. It's one of the professor in psychology, Mr. Hüting. He was a soldier, a conscript soldier in Indonesia, and he goes on TV. and he says, I committed war crimes. He admits this. And then there's a huge amount of aggression against him. Of course, military, when you attack the military, if you attack one, you attack them all, so they gather together and they deny everything. And this keeps on going. And this is not only from the military point of view, it's also the academic world. If you look at the academic publications from 1950s until quite recently, there's not so much written about, no research being done about this situation, about the decolonization. And this changes around 2008, more or less, because part of this generation is now gone, and the children and grandchildren, they are more interested in this history. And they start being more activistic. And especially also in 2008, there is the Dutch government doesn't recognize any wrongdoing in Indonesia in this way. And there is a civil court case brought by the widows of WWII, they are called. This is a small village in Indonesia where the Dutch army killed, like, I don't know, 150 men in 1948. And these widows, they go to court in the Netherlands, a civil court case, and they win. So the Dutch government, is the first time they have to recognize the judge tells them to take responsibility for this, and they do. And then this starts to become an issue more and more, and the Dutch government is more or less forced to pay for a big research on a definitive answer on this violence. Okay, what kind of violence? Were there war crimes committed in this decolonization war? And this is the result. You can find all these publications. Some of it is already in English, and it's all free. You can download it for free. So these books, there are several books, several details of it. If you're interested in this, you can go online and download them. As I said, some of it's in Dutch, but most of it will be translated. It's already available. And then you mentioned already King William went to Indonesia and gave excuses and stuff. So this is still going on. It doesn't stop. And the same probably in Australia. This has no ending in a way until what should be the end of it. We use this kind of publications too in our museum, of course, to have a discussion about this. Not to point fingers, but to have discussion. Okay, going back to what we started, how do we want to live together? What kind of democracy? What does it mean to be in a democracy? And in a democracy, it's incredibly important to have citizens who can vote, who know how to vote. What are you going to vote for? And you have to be knowledgeable about politics, about framing, about propaganda, and you have to make your own choice in the end in the booth where you make this choice. And that's why it's important also to have institutions. And again, going back to the current situation, if you see that in many countries, institutions are being closed. But we need institutions, we need museums that tell the truth, or are a forum to have this kind of discussions. But that's also why we think that having this heritage association is hugely important. Gather all these stories, but don't only tell stories. Also give the context of these stories. And it's also important to think about the context. Who's talking? Who's telling the stories? Why? What is their background and stuff? That's what we also try to do. Thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting me.